Thank you very much. You know, one of the advantages, and I see a number of people here who share this with me now, but I found that one of the advantages of moving, I hope somewhat gently, into middle age is that you remember stuff. And so I want to take you back for just a moment with me to something that happened not all that long ago. January of the year 2005. In January of 2005, then President George W. Bush went up to Capitol Hill to give his State of the Union message. Just that week, the people of Iraq had held their first election post Saddam Hussein. And President Bush and the members of his party, and certainly the congressional members of his party, were quite proud, as they saw it, of having spread democracy and freedom around the world. And there is an iconic moment in that State of the Union that some of you may remember, which is that one of the devices, because of course there weren't really any voting rolls in Iraq after the fall of the Hussein regime. So what they did is they simply permitted people to line up, and people lined up in droves, sometimes actually facing physical danger in order to cast their ballot. And when people voted and when they were finished, they were asked to dip their finger in ink so they couldn't simply vote again somewhere else. You would have this indelible ink on your finger. And a group of members of Congress banded together and dipped their ink in like-minded ink. And when President Bush spoke of this event, they all raised their fingers up and wagged them in the air, proud of having been part of this moment where they were spreading democracy and freedom around the world and encouraging people to vote. On that night, there was not a single state in the United States that required anyone to present a photo ID in order to vote. Today, there are 16. The person who rounded up those members of Congress, provided the ink, and was seen in the middle of the group wagging his finger filled with ink was a guy by the name of Bobby Jindal, who is now the governor of the state of Louisiana, who signed a voter ID bill. There is in this country today an effort at voter suppression which goes further and does more than anything we have seen since before the adoption of the Voting Rights Act in 1964. And there are really four elements of it that I want to talk about very quickly. And the first is, I've mentioned it, it's the one we all know, it's the one we all think of, are these voter identification schemes. As you know, a number of states have adopted a requirement that in order to vote, in order to appear at your ballot place and vote, your precinct, your polling place, a place where you may have been voting for 50 or 60 or 70 years, you have to now produce a state-issued photo identification card. My favorite part of this story, just because I think there's humor in watching the way that this has been contorted, is the way some states have manipulated this. Now, you probably already know that, for example, in Wisconsin, which has adopted one of these, when the law was passed, you would be permitted to use your state driver's license or your state ID, but you would not be permitted to use your student ID from the University of Wisconsin or a photo identification card issued by the Wisconsin Veterans Department. In Texas, and we all know that everything is great in Texas, you can use your gun owner's identification card, but you cannot use a student ID. Somehow, I guess, being a gun owner makes you more valid to live and work and participate in a democracy than being a student. We are fighting these measures across the country, candidly, a little bit uphill. And that is because that the first of these laws that was challenged in court was the law in Indiana. And it was challenged by our colleagues at the ACLU affiliate in Indiana. And it was challenged under, particularly under the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution, saying you're treating votes differently because those people who have access to an identification card more easily are being favored over those who do not. And I'll talk a little bit, although we've heard a little bit, I'll talk a little bit about who those people aren't and what that looks like. This case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and I know this will shock you, in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court upheld this provision on the basis and on the rationale that the state did have an interest in precluding so-called voter impersonation fraud. Now, the problem here is twofold. The one is, of course, that there were no examples across Indiana of any voter impersonation fraud, which was said to be the reason for this law in the first instance. And the second problem was, at least in our view, was that the court's majority, led by Justice Scalia, actually wrote in the measure that if people were disenfranchised as a result of not having an identification card, it, quote, wouldn't really affect that many people, therefore making it by. So no cases of fraud on the one hand, there might be some people affected on the other, okay, we'll let that go. But the one thing that the court did, and the one thing that happened, and without being overly technical, the law was challenged by the ACLU before it ever went in effect, and it was challenged on this broad equal protection ground in the federal Constitution. And the court said, if these laws were put in place and if you could demonstrate the actual harm and et cetera, you could bring back challenges to these in the future. And so in Wisconsin and in Pennsylvania and in a number of other states, these laws are now being challenged on the grounds of the state constitutions, usually much more explicit provisions about both equal protection and about equality, and especially about racial equality. So the law which was passed in Wisconsin, for example, has been enjoined and is not enforced, and I think is likely not to be enforced for the November elections. The Pennsylvania law is a little more complicated in terms of what's happening, and I think this one really demonstrates, if you forgive the phrase, sort of the peculiar nature of these laws. The state of Pennsylvania passed this law. The legislature, which was controlled by the first time in many years by Republicans, put in the purposes of the law that they were seeking to stamp out rampant voter fraud. And when the law was challenged and it went to court, they couldn't produce a single instance in which there had been voter impersonation, which is the only thing these kinds of things can stop. The U.S. Department of Justice has actually joined the lawsuit in Pennsylvania that the ACLU has been pursuing. I think, again, this has now gone up to the appellate court. I think it is likely, again, that Voter ID Act will not be in place in Philadelphia, and it will not be in place in Ohio when we get to the November elections. The Texas law that I mentioned, the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, has actually challenged, and a court in D.C. recently struck down, actually because Texas was one of the states that was covered by the Voting Rights Act. And so in order to make any substantial changes to their voting system, they have to get approval, or pre-approval as it's called, from the Department of Justice and from the courts. And the courts looked at this and they said that it wasn't permissible under the Voting Rights Act. And the reason for that is, as most of you know, that there's a very specific profile of the person in our country who does not have a state-issued photo ID. Those people tend to be people of color. They tend to be people who are poor. They tend to be seniors, or they tend to be very young people, or they tend to be people who are disabled. Here's a news flash for you. Those people all tend to vote for a particular party. And it's not the party who has power in the states that have adopted these measures. This is not a coincidence. 1 in 10 people across America don't have a state-issued ID. 1 in 4 people who are people of color don't have a state-issued photo ID. This is about suppressing people's votes who won't support you. This is about changing the dynamics of an election. In 2008, it is estimated by most demographers in the Census Department and looking at the election results, 5 million new voters of color joined the electorate in 2008. Guess how many people, just roughly, would be suppressed if all of these measures were to go into place all across the United States of America? 5 million. It would put the electorate back looking much more like it was in 2004 than what it did in 2008. As some people have said, and I think it's quaint and it's a great rhetorical point, some people have observed that this whole scheme is sort of a solution in search of a problem. Well, I think that really misstates it, because it is clearly not a solution. And the fact is that it's the problem. So we can't permit these kinds of things to go into place. But I do want to add quickly that the voter ID thing, although I think it gets the most attention, although goodness knows not enough, the voter ID laws are not the only measures that are really designed to suppress votes that we're seeing around the country. We are seeing, for example, and seeing the folks here from Florida reminds me, we're seeing once again the purging of voter rolls on the slimmest of evidence, or the smallest of means, usually done by outside private companies that have political connections. And so we see a dramatic reduction in some communities in terms of the number of people who are actually on the voting rolls and who are eligible. The other thing that we're seeing a lot of, and most recently and most notably in Ohio, where a federal court has now stepped in, is the shrinking of access to early voting. 35% of all voters in 2008 engaged in some form or fashion of early voting. 52% of people of color who voted in 2008 engaged in some form or fashion of early voting. It's convenient, it's quick, it's often something when people are excited and in the process for the first time. It's the way they often go and participate, so that isn't surprising. So if you can shrink access to that, you shrink away those votes, or you certainly shrink away the margins that come from those votes in that way. And then finally, and I have to say, in one of the absolutely most devious things that we're seeing around the country, and again, our friends from Florida seem to come up with all the bad ideas. Forgive me, I don't mean to criticize, but is new efforts to really undermine voter registration drives. Again, most of the people who are captured in voter registration drives tend to be new voters. They tend to be younger voters. They tend to be voters on college campuses. They tend to be voters from communities that have traditionally been underserved. That's where people register to vote, usually as a result of a voter registration drive. It's not something they think of doing when they're signing up for their driver's license or in some other setting. So these voter registration drives are very important in terms of increasing the diversity of our voting pool and of our electorate as our country becomes more and more diverse. And so what has happened, and I think the example in Florida in a law that happily, in some measure thanks to the ACLU, has now been struck down, is that they actually created a penalty and suggested that a person had to not only date but put a time on the form for voter registration for when they filled it out, and that the person who was collecting those had 48 hours from the moment that the person filled it out to get it submitted to the proper county authority. And secondly, they said, if there was an error of any kind on that form, the person who was registering them, the registrar, in many cases, people like the League of Women Voters, there was a criminal penalty which would attach that included felony charges simply for somebody misstating an address, perhaps using an old address, perhaps using a maiden name. And it caused many groups, including groups like the League of Women Voters, to simply say that they weren't going to engage in voter registration in the state of Florida up until the time that the law was enjoined. I don't think that's coincidence. I don't think that's happenstance. I think that's passing a law and putting penalties in place in order to accomplish a particular goal. You know, I think back sometimes as I, read these statistics and as I think about these numbers and as I look at the way these things have rolled across the country. And I watch these same guys get up on my TV who were waving their fingers in the air with the ink just 7 years ago, talk about how we have to keep the election from being, quote, stolen from us. Well, who's stealing what? Who is it that's stealing? 5 million of our new citizens who are participating in elections? The truth is I'm happy, in many ways, or I'm pleased in many ways that I work for a nonpartisan organization. It turns out whoever wins the presidential election will be pissed at them by February. But the truth is I'd rather see an election in which 80% or 90% or 100% of the people participated no matter what the outcome. Because then we would have had a national discussion and we would have made a national decision. And these and none of this even goes to these sort of political tricks of limiting votes by telling people the wrong day or the wrong location or those kinds of things. These are things which are written into law in order to keep people from participating. Now, I'm happy to report to you tonight that none of these measures are in place in the state of Illinois, and none of these measures have a snowball's chance in a very warm place of ever being in place in our state. They have been rejected time and time and time again by the legislature when they've been raised, and I suspect while we will still have some who will introduce them every year because apparently it makes for a great press release in certain parts of our state, that we are doing a good job in terms of at least blocking those sorts of things. But the truth is there ought to be more effort into getting people to vote and less effort into suppressing it. Goodness knows if we can celebrate voting in Iraq, we ought to be able to do it here in the United States of America. Thank you all very much.